my pleasure to very briefly introduce the first artist and the person that she will be speaking with. Anne Hamilton is an internationally recognized visual artist specializing in large-scale multimedia installations, public projects, and performance collaborations. Responsive to the contingencies of the sites where she works, her recurring forms, cloth, texts spoken and written, animals, and people suspended or in motion, immerse viewers in an atmosphere both visceral and literary, individual and collective, animate and inanimate, silent and spoken. She received a BFA in textile design from the University of Kansas in 1979, and an MFA in sculpture from the Yale School of Art in 1985, where she studied under David von Schlegel, Ursula von Reidensward, and Judy Pfaff, and was in the same class as Jessica Stockholder. From 1985 to 1991, she taught on the faculty of the University of California at Santa Barbara. And Hamilton has served on the faculty of the Ohio State University since 2001, where she is a distinguished university professor in the Department of Art. She has asked me to be brief. I haven't observed that quite as stringently as she requested, but so I will not enumerate the many honors that she has received, including a MacArthur Fellowship. She has represented the United States in the 1991 Sao Paulo Biennial and the 1999 Venice Biennale, and has exhibited extensively around the world, receiving commissions from a wide variety of international organizations as well. Today, Anne Hamilton will be in conversation with art historian Jenni Sorkin, who will also be delivering a paper in the second panel of this day this afternoon. Jenni Sorkin is Associate Professor of History of Art and Architecture at the University of California, Santa Barbara. She writes on the intersections between gender, material culture, and contemporary art, working primarily on women artists and underrepresented media. Her books include Live Form, Women, Ceramics, and Community, published by University of Chicago Press in 2016. Revolution in the Making, Abstract Sculpture by Women Artists, 1947 to 2016, published by Skira in 2016. And Art in California, published by Thames and Hudson as part of the World of Art series this year, as well as numerous essays in journals and exhibition catalogs. She was educated at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, Bard College, and received her PhD from Yale University in 2010. She is a member of the editorial board of the Journal of Modern Craft. And now I turn it over to the two of you.
Great, thank you.
Hi, thank you, everybody. I think it would be really nice, since we are at a Yale conference and we keep referencing Yale, to just give us a little bit of background, Anne, about what your time at Yale was like. Just for the audience, David von Schlegel is not a household name anymore. He was in primary structures. He was a minimalist, maybe a lesser known one, but ran Yale's sculpture area for 2 decades and brought in a number of visiting critics, as the system still is, among them who were Judy Pfaff and Ursula von Reidensward, who you've mentioned, but you also studied with a professor named Leslie Ratto, who was an American Studies professor, and you took an important class with her. And you knew Susan Howe, who is an experimental poet married to von Schlegel. And so I guess I'm wondering if you could just give us a little bit of sensibility or flavor of what the early 80s felt like as a woman making sculpture in the MFA program.
Thank you, Jenny. And thank you for being in conversation. This is one that actually started earlier this summer, and I'm really happy to be part of this conference and draw that thread forward. You know, when I applied to come to the sculpture department in Yale, it was because I came from a background in textiles, and I understood that my work was relational in every way, and it was a relationship at that point between things in space. Uh, and I thought that that's what sculpture was. So I, I had an incredible experience, a pivotal experience really at Yale. But I do remember one thing that was asked at the interview when you interview to enter the program, and that was, "You don't do this weaving stuff anymore, do you?" And, this kind of assumption of value that devalued um, those crafts, those processes, those materials. And we're obviously at a really different time right now. But I remember, well, I think maybe in some ways it's been this long process of returning to that hand and to understanding how fundamental an underlayment is to everything, to my thinking and everything I do. But Leslie Rado, the class in American Studies, which was really on the cultural construction of death and attitudes towards the body, was a place where I found a conversation that really complemented what was going on in the sculpture program and the art program more largely, and why I loved being in a research university where one could travel between disciplines and programs and attend lectures, all over the university. So I feel like I'm still, I don't know what I might say, feeding off some of the early influences of the readings and the work that was done there.
I will just say for the audience, we are not going to primarily talk about the images. They're kind of going to be an interlude behind us, but because there is this line that keeps appearing and the sort of thread of the line, which is the inventory of the line, which are titles that Anne has worked through. I do want to go back to this through line about the weaving stuff that you mentioned, and the idea that several generations before, Ani Albers kind of haunts Yale as a kind of fundamental person who isn't teaching in the art school, but is of course present in some way or not. But I guess I'm wondering, because her work has been fundamental to yours, could you just maybe touch on this idea of a woman artist who doesn't get to be part of the culture, or whose work is fundamental, or the idea of exclusions right away in the question of, you don't work on this weaving stuff anymore, and how that might have influenced your own ability to interact in that environment?
Well, specifically about Annie Albers, she was living in New Haven when I was in graduate school, and I was too meek. I don't know. I was too shy to just go knock on her door, and that's something I have forever regretted. And I think that one of the things that I draw forward from her work in so many ways is how to think about cloth processes as social relationships, and cloth as a really democratic object where every part has to be and do its work for the whole to literally hold. And I think what I found very early was a way to, because we had these incredible studios at Yale over in sculpture, and I think I found a way to think about the architecture as the edge of cloth, the edge of the outside of the body. And so I think in a lot of ways I was able to bring the processes and the materials, but into a very different form and context, because we had these, the surround of the studio to also present in.
Well, and cloth in itself is highly architectural. The weaving of cloth, the making of cloth it's an architectural form of planning. There's a kind of planning that goes into making cloth, and it does become about a kind of system of gridding and measurement. And when you talk in this very beautiful and poetic way about the edge of cloth being the edge of the body, there are, selvages and floating wefts and all of these different kinds of ways of finishing or weaving through or building the intricacies of layers, which is very much like the process of structure. It is a kind of structural process. And there's a kind of precision and mathematics that goes into weaving that is largely unknown to a public that doesn't make cloth. And it's a process that we've gotten very far away from as a culture. And I guess I'm wondering how that how cloth itself as a kind of grid form, and it wafts in so much of your work, but it's present in almost all of the work that you do in some fashion. Not all of it, but there's a kind of textile process that is a through line through much of your work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think you can even see it in the image that's on the screen, which is a text-based piece. It's a floor of cork that you walk over, but you see that it's made up of rows and lines that are actually literally woven by a spine of words. And um, I think that deep structure finds many different forms, not necessarily the crossing of two threads, and is in some ways how the form has evolved to be a field, a landscape, a surround, the way a cloth might hold one. And, I think a lot about the fact that there are really very few times in our life where, in some form or another, cloth is not touching us. In the shower, but we're still being touched by water. And that it's something we know because of its felt quality. Like, it's so interesting to me that when we refer to a quality of cloth outside of its structure or in addition to its structure, it's like, what is the hand of the cloth? And it's like it's trying to describe this quality that a material has, which is always a consequence of its structure. And yet it's something that you can only know by touching. And so, when I choose or research, I don't necessarily make the cloth that's in my work, but when I'm doing the research, it's like it's so much about these very subtle qualities that are in some ways resist language, but is something that you can recognize and feel.
Well, and that tactile is, and the bodily, even when you describe the spine of the grid on the overlay of words, the edges of the cloth, that there's this kind of bodily presence in all of your work. And there's also a lot of text and textile. There's a long tradition in fiber-based communities, but also in thinking through text and textile as fundamentally intertwined kinds of exchanges, and that there is a concordance or interweaving, we might say, between those two fundamental ideas, and that is something that really works its way through your entire body of work in various ways. There's a lot of language in your work. Could you maybe talk to us about the use of language and this kind of fundamental tactility that courses through?
Well, I love the fact that the word textile envelopes the word text, so it's like, I guess, the cloth of text is the word textile. And I think, maybe relative even to a lot of this morning's conversation is that how do we reconcile our experience, our bodily experience in all its components with our ability to bring language to that experience? And that it seems that there's always, well, it's always moving, but there's this challenge or this impossibility in some ways for, you can't hear these videos. I guess we're talking over them, but um, and I think that so much of my work has pivoted off of how that ability to know things through the language, the words that we use, the names that we resist, the closure that in some ways we refuse but we expect of language, and on the other hand, what we know through the way our bodies take up space in the world and our, sensory, we're sensory, obviously, organisms, and that we think through all of those senses. And so, actually, just to address what has come up on the slide, this is actually an oral this was meant to be spoken by, as a kind of choral reading. And there are a couple of, there's a lot of sound work in some of my practice. And I started to think about the chorus really as just the sonified cloth, that you have all of these individual voices that are then coming together to make this larger membrane of experience. And then the floors, the video that was up earlier, where you see the kind of raised text, and we'll see that later in in the project that's in the subway in New York. It's that the language is tactile, so it's proud of the letter forms themselves are proud of the surface. In some ways, I think the impulse to reach one's hand and touch it is almost equivalent, or maybe usurps the impulse to read the meaning that the letter forms carry, and those things are always in relation. And yeah,
Okay.
here there is an erasure. I mean, this is a piece where the Reznikov poems, which really account for, or are an accounting of legal cases at the turn of the century chronicling property and racial violence, have been translated into this Jeffersonian kind of space in the form of Braille. So it's there haunting this icon of architecture at the same time that it's not really legible.
And this was done for the Venice Biennale presentation.
1999.
99. And it makes me think a lot about this idea of sensation and feeling, and tactility, and the way our bodies process experience and then turn to language for understanding is kind of a mirroring of trauma theory. And I'm wondering if I know poetry has been really important to you, but has trauma theory, which is really happening, so much of the writing of it is happening simultaneous to your practice. I'm wondering if that enriches your practice, or if it's just a kind of intuitive leaning toward some of these juxtapositions.
Oh gosh, that's such a good question. I think it's more intuitive. It's not. I think it's something that I pay attention to through a lot of the podcasts that I listen to, but it's not really, an area that I'm reading deeply in. But I do think about, like, how do things become real to us? Even though the word "real" is obviously such a complicated one, but I think a lot about how, well, like, if information changed us, the world would not be in the shape that it's in. And that it's when we are motivated by a strong felt quality that comes from our experience that we act, that we say, that we speak, that we find new names, that we change. And so it's like, I think there's this contradiction in the work, or this kind of tension between that impulse to do that, to name, to find the words, to find the language, and on the other hand, this resistance to being categorized by it.
And the language in the piece we're looking at, this is the World Trade Center platform. Next door is the Calatrava building. This is, the new platform. It's quite an honor and a privilege to get to do this. This particular platform is very fraught. I'm wondering if you could talk about the experience of materializing that space through language, and what it meant to represent or not represent the qualities that embody the trauma of the World Trade Center?
So complicated to try to find form for the conditions of that site and its history. I, I think that as I was developing this, I was thinking a lot about what are the words we need to hear now? What do we need to say now? Where do those come from? And thinking about it as obviously a national and an international site of public and private mourning. And so when I turn to the documents that weave this piece, these very familiar phrases from the preamble to the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident. And to have that structure, the horizontal lines, which come from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was drafted after the Second World War, is the structure means that there are many repetitions as you walk down that wall. And so the experience of the piece is really in motion. And what's happening I think if you walk by it, or even if you stand by it, waiting for the subway, is that those words are recomposed by every time you pass it, even if you're a commuter and you go through that station every single day. And I'm thinking about that as a kind of refrain or as a chorus of the kind of civic ideals that we hope structure life above ground in that space. So it's like, while the documents are historical, the form in which they're woven are not. And they create something that really puts, in some ways, the authorship into the person walking along the platform.
And I think it's also meant to be a welcoming and democratic space. You see the word everyone, 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 everyone is one of the spines that gets repeated over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also raised. So there's a kind of tactility to the meaning. And people do lean on subway walls. There's, very little space to sit often. I don't know how many benches are in that subway, but it's the kind of thing you would lean on and then feel literally against your body.
Yeah. And it comes into your space. So it also, I think, maybe this is partly an address of the work, like it invites you in, like just as the cloth might envelop you, it invites you in. It's a continuous field. It's a landscape that really runs almost the whole length of both the northbound and southbound tracks of the subway. And I think what I love is that it's not part of the memorial literally, and it's not it is part of the MTA project. It's commissioned by the MTA, and you have this kind of access that you don't have in other kinds of spaces for work. It's a public work in such a different way. It's just there. And it's not a 24-hour station, but it's pretty available.
But what's so interesting is that in pursuing these public projects or in going this direction, it's almost a direct contrast to so much of the ambiguity that permeates many of your museum projects and other kinds of projects, because to do a public project with the MTA and the City of New York requires giving up ambiguity, right? You have to give them a whole structure and format. You have to sell them on your idea. It's the antithesis of your earlier work in a way. Has that been a sort of struggle to reconcile, or has it been a new challenge?
I think it's just a new challenge, because all the work responds to the condition that you find yourself in, right? And it's like the form comes from how I understand that condition, its possibilities. What can you do in this space? And remarkably, really, and it's really with thanks to the leadership of Sandra Bloodworth, who led that project and curates that program, is it just kept being embraced. It was like it wasn't even mine. It just kept walking through. And so, in many ways, while it had many, many, many steps and hundreds of meetings, I felt like there was this collective will to want to see this thing against all odds happen. And, but, when I think with a lot of public work, there is this challenge, like you say, of trying to insert something into this space that doesn't have closure in terms of its meaningfulness, and that it's just like in my own process, I want to hold the process open as long as possible, and that also goes for the person experiencing the work. It's like before you know what it is, you have to experience it. You can't first go to what you think it is or what it's about or whatever, and that's a challenge, and it's like I think the way I work is to try to bring people inside the thinking of the questions, and instead of um, and when you invite people in, I think you create a different atmosphere for the conversation. And that's how I've thought about, like at the Armory Project. Like it was really important. It wouldn't have been a part anyone probably really noticed that it was part of the piece, but we built all these wooden benches to put around the perimeter. And it's partly I wanted there to be a place for you to be. Anybody could have a seat anywhere. We did the ticketing in such a way that you don't have to check your coat, you don't have to check your bag. It was um, how do you make a atmosphere of invitation?
And that's also part of the collaborative aspects of your work, that there's always been early on, there was a kind of seated performer that we could say is maybe a proxy for the artist or the persona of the artist, performing, doing some sort of hand labor in the space. And then later on that becomes enlarged in other forms throughout your work, in which spectators or visitors become part of the work, like the swings, where you swing in the space, you're invited to complete the space. It's fundamental to take part in the work, or to touch the work, or to have the work rain down on you, for instance, with the pink powder or the fuchsia powder at Venice, that the viewer becomes absolutely important as being fundamental to the work itself. But then these large teams of people that you also work with. So the work becomes almost operatic in scale, and has been compared to Robert Wilson, a kind of influence on and within both directions of Pina Bausch, Meredith Monk, who you've worked with. But what does it mean to operate on the scale that you've been operating on in terms of managing teams of people, thinking about these new conceptions of paid labor versus volunteerism of a previous era? These are all sort of, fraught questions and change in different formats.
Yeah, and how do you support a process that doesn't necessarily result in an object, right? That can maybe have a life in another market outside its temporary iteration. The early work definitely, as you said, was like the volunteer quilting bee in some ways, laying thousands of pennies into a bed of honey, or stitching with a lot of different hands, and I think that people came and went from that process in different ways. I think there's something to me that was always so I know, satisfying about sitting in a room with sometimes complete stranger, but with busy hands, and the kind of intimacy of that, and how you know someone very quickly that you don't really know by the forms of attention that come from these dual attentions that are part of those processes.
And time spent together doing hand labor is a kind of it, you talk to people. It breeds conversation.
And I also think you listen differently when your hands are busy, right? Like it's like you're doing this and you're paying attention to everything that's going on in your lap at the same time, the conversation and registering the atmosphere around you. And that I think that tunes one's kind of attention and the way one listens. I recommend everyone knit in a faculty meeting. It really changes it. Uh, but you know, I
Why we
think
give kids fidget spinners now. I mean, this is instead of a textile process, they're given fidget spinners or a digital apparatus.
yeah. Well, it's because we think through our hands. You know, a huge part of our brain is devoted to this. Um, and that kind of embodiment, embodied experience, the kind of knowledge that it's part of what we were talking about earlier with something being felt, like it comes into you. It's now part of um, it's now part of your body in a different way. I think that's probably why handwriting is still, in some ways, even though the generation now is really mostly not writing with a pencil or pen by hand. I've been reading some articles recently that talk about like when you listen and you read and you write at the same time, the retention is very different because it's going into this project, which is one of motion. And that's also why I think, in so much of the work, and not even just the earlier work, there is a person, sometimes me, often other people who've helped make the work present, engaging in that ongoing labor. And it's the relationship of those acts and that labor to the surround that makes the work. And this kind of seeking of form that continues those processes and the process of thinking into the public realm of the work. So I always felt like the opening was the funeral, and it's where it's like, oh, so now all this process is over, and wanting to think about, well, how do I continue the life of making and this continuing to evolve and change, that and for which the opening might be a very artificial marker. And I think in many ways that question of how do you continue that thinking energy presence has motivated in many ways the form, um, not only to work on these gigantic spaces, which um, I love working in big space. It's the experience of the body in space, that way that you feel your own volume in relationship to a larger volume. You're held, but also to find forms of circulation like the mail. All the image work recently has been about things that circulate by hand in a very different way.
We're looking at a really early piece that are these body objects. That one is a suit made of toothpicks. I'm just trying to narrate when I see things. I'm wondering, because there is a kind of reception in terms of your work as being, you've always worked with women, among women. Women curators have supported your practice and been really fundamental to inviting projects. Sarah Rogers, Lynn Cook, Katie Klein, Helene Posner, Mary Beebe. I guess I'm wondering, could you talk a little bit about, we are at a conference about women, about this idea of the gendered reception of your work, or what it means to have a kind of, I don't know, intuitive understanding that many women bring to this ambiguity that you present in your projects.
Or that women feel comfortable with that, right? Like form and formlessness sit next to each other maybe more comfortably. Um, I do remember when I was in Venice, and you have this really like incredibly intense, really, really fine pink powder falling down over this enlarged braille around the walls. and really empty spaces. And I remember particularly a group of male curators coming in and went, oh, like really like a visceral reaction, get me out of here. I think there was a little bit of that too, to the sort of oceanic flora of horsehair that was in the, I think it's part of these slides in at the
Tropos.
DB Foundation Tropos. Yeah, that when you open the door, the work insists that you enter it, right? You're entangled. You're immediately entangled in its landscape, and I think that makes a lot of people very nervous. But it's asking, maybe insisting, on a relationship. And I mean, I haven't actually, until you asked me this question the other day, Jenny, I haven't really thought so much about a gendered response to the work. Um, I think that, my focus is so much on what is the work? How do I even understand what it is? And, um, and so, that's one I'm going to have to think about for a while.
That's okay. I do want to ask you one more question about this idea of moving from spaces of being able to be incredibly poetic, like what we're watching, that could not be fixed in a public sphere, and moving toward public work. There's a whole generation of women practitioners that come before you, many who started out as land artists or minimalists, Agnes Denis, Mary Miss, Jackie Ferrara, who in the second half of their careers moved toward public projects. Morelli Lauderman Euclides, doing large scale public projects instead of performance-based work. But so much of your early work has these performative, ambiguous qualities, and then you move to the fixed sphere. And I wonder if there's a kind of momentum that pushes women artists out of the marketplace or out of the museum and into public work. And where do you sort of, I don't know, you have a kind of bird's eye view of your career as you've just retired from Ohio State and are now emeritus. I'm wondering if you could maybe speak to that.
Yeah, well, it's like the museum and gallery are really good at what they do. But what they do is display objects that, in some way or another, for the most part, are fixed in their form, right? And so I've had some really interesting conversations. Madeline Grinstein, when she was at SF MoMA, it's like, well, how do we bring your work into the collection? And what does it mean to bring its object relationships in? But I think it's very hard for those institutional structures to hold what is actually alive in the work. And I think that there's also this question about, well, where does then work go? Into a dark closet and into a storage bin, and it insists on an economy of care. And certainly there are many economies of care running through the work. The ongoing life of the work is full of care, acts of care, when it's in public. But I think it was really, in some ways, this turn that's maybe most obvious with the project at the Armory is really thinking about the drill hall as this enormous civic space, and what are the conditions we have in this culture in North America for people to come together and share the same space across their many differences, and how are we both alone and how are we together, and how does civic space and animating it, occupying it in a different way, invite a different relation. Like at the Armory, which is because it really could hold hundreds of people. It was like it was like an indoor park at a certain point. People spent a really lot of time in the space. And I think we're willing to be in relationship to each other because when you when you got on a swing and that structure took your weight, it also, uh, I think it opened your heart. I think people were incredibly generous to each other in the dynamic I saw in that space. And so, like, how do you make those conditions for people to enter with each other? And can working in civic public space, the realm, like, can I participate in um, tuning it? I guess is the word, really, because it's like you're tuning it. Um, I don't know if that was really your question, Jenny. Was it?
That's okay. I think it also means taking the kind of tenor of the space and trying to understand the space and work within the space. I think my question was more about the market and mid-career women being driven out of it because it either doesn't work for them or because there is no place. Once you have emerged, we might say that unless you are constantly producing objects that are fixed, as you say, that can seamlessly enter a collection, that there isn't another way of practice. And your career has been about combining multimedia and finding these other ways of practice through sight, through the site itself, which does not lend itself to fixed, documentary-based images. It requires a lot of description. I am interested in the fact that SF MoMA did end up purchasing, or it has in their collection now, Indigo Blue, which was done originally for the Spoleto Festival in South Carolina and curated by Mary Jane Jacob in, is it 92? I might have the year wrong.
Around then, yeah.
Yeah. But what kinds of conversations did that require with the institution itself to take in, many, many pounds of textiles?
Yeah, well, and of course, because the piece didn't really exist anymore. So, we had lifted the cotton blue work clothing out of one place that it was sitting, in a recycling economy at the time that the piece was made. And in fact, it was very interesting when we went to reconstitute it. It's like the cotton, blue, indigo work clothing hardly exists anymore. And partly it's fire resistant, and a lot of I think that a lot of it is worn, or was at one time worn, by welders with other protective equipment. And the other thing about the cloth, we spent a lot of time, because cloth holds temperature and smell. And so when you walk into a room, it's something you sense, whether or not you consciously register it. And so that was important in the discussions. But the bigger thing was that I realized how much I was asking the institution to take on, how much space the thing took up. I was asking them to, whenever they show it, and I think it's going to be on display soon, next year, that there be a reader who is also erasing books in relationship to it. It was the relationship between this work clothing and the book that was central to it. And how do we no longer have the building, we're not in Charleston, we don't have the immediate social condition of that original piece, but can you bring the object relations forward into this very different context? And when we first installed it, I wanted it to be in, as large as it was, I wanted it to be in a room with other works. I didn't want to isolate it like a tableau or a picture. And
or keep like a ribbon, a stanchion in front of it too, I assume, because you actually have to, circle the piece to see the whole thing. It's on a platform. All these folded textiles are folded. I think it'll show up in this slide image, but soon, but it's on a raised platform, and that scale changes things too, because it's not on the floor.
Right, exactly. And really it was a huge pile that was built by a layer of pants and a shirt. So they were laid out, as bodies. And there's a video in here that I put in of the gesture of actually touching, soothing, building the geology of that structure. That was then, I think, what I've always said, well, this is a felt quality in the work. The number of times these are touched is something that maybe you can't point to a name, but you can feel.
And it's also about the laboring bodies of the past, the histories of indigo and slavery and plantation culture, and then the transfer of that to sharecropping industries and laboring Black bodies. And then also then the ultimate death of the textile industry and the mill culture in South Carolina. There's a whole sort of history built into the single, uniform, the work uniform.
Exactly. Like when I was beginning that piece, and this is a thing that the work, I'm on site for a very long time. And I was sharing, living with Mary Jane Jacob, the curator, and every morning, I could hear these historical tours in carriages going by talking about this famous Charlestonian or that famous Charlestonian. And I was like, well, what about the people? That and all of the complexity of the economy. The site where it was originally installed was around not far from a market where slaves had once been auctioned, and that was that was something that was really important to me to think about, to reference in some ways as I built that project.
And then when it will be on view at SF MoMA, I'm wondering, will there be a text panel, or will you insist upon, because artists do have some sort of control over how it's displayed. Do you want an interpretive panel or a didactic panel on the wall that explains the context or the social history of the piece?
I don't ever want anything to explain anything. So,
Sorry, this is the teacher in me.
I don't remember what we have up as is the panel that accompanies it. That's a good question. I need to go back and look at what is up or drafted or what we talked about at the time. But I think that I sometimes have spent a lot of time working on those texts and have had quite heated discussions sometimes with the curator or the education program about the language that is in there. Because I'm like, I want to invite you in by the way things are described, not to tell you what they mean. And so you want to provide handles and context, which is really what you're talking about. Like how is the language give context? And that's a tricky business, really. I mean, I think
Very.
there's such a, like you just go in a museum, people are immediately over to the panel, and into the language before they're into the experience in front of the actual work.
So certainly your work is collected in many institutions, but is this the first big installation that will be sort of on view, or a kind of history, a documentation project, we might say? Is this the one that is the first one that's sort of ensconced institutionally, or are there others?
There are very few. There is an earlier one. It was a collaboration with the artist Catherine Clark, and it's called Palimpsest, and it's at the in the Hirshhorn collection. But it's a much smaller work, but it does have a living system. It has snails and cabbages in it, and it when they put it up, all of that has to go in place to display it. The thing that the piece that is really still intact and is in situ is the one in Sweden, in Vanes. There's a large installation that was in a several story stone barn, and that is been preserved. It's there, it's ongoing. And unlike these other works that have changed context. But I think thinking about that question really led me to the project with Steve Oliver and the building of the tower in Sonoma. And so I was thinking, in many ways, well, I had borrowed 3 sheep from Steve for the project at Cap Street.
And we should just say this is an early project in your career when you were still living in California.
Yeah. And it led to multiple years of visiting and conversation. And ultimately, we built a very tall 80-foot tower that has a double helical staircase in it. But it was really thinking about how does that spatial condition change the relationship between a performer and an audience, at where instead of being face to face, as you would be in an auditorium or venue, you are wound between each other, but you can't actually reach each other. And on the same staircase or the opposite staircases. And thinking about his work, commissioning artists, doing really these ambitious projects that required a lot of, you can imagine, building an 80-foot cast in place concrete tower. But what does it invite? What does that structure, to return to the textile question, what does that structure then allow to happen? So this is, I've gone from responding to conditions and to thinking about how do you make a condition that invites a different experience, sociability, and then a series of artists commissioning to actually work in that space. And it's thinking about that probably that is tied up with this question you're asking earlier about not so much a refusal of the market, but it's like, where are the conditions where you can make the work that you want to make? And that's a very complicated set of conditions.
And even more so when, if I borrow your term sociability, where you have a kind of non-Anthropocene sociability that courses through your work with the use of live animals, moths, which no institution wants in their building, peacocks, snails, pigeons. There's a whole host of animal bodies that permeate your installations. And that also creates a kind of refusal or a space that insists upon alternative solutions and ideas about permanence and impermanence, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's about so many of those are also these ongoing acts within the work of care, right? It's a living system of relations that you're tending. And when I think about it, I grew up with a wonderful, my mother's now 91, and I was very close to my grandmother, and they were both people who did a lot of volunteer work in the community. So I grew up listening to my mother ask people for help and to help take care of things. And so I think that, sometimes we laugh because it's like, oh, I'm kind of doing the same thing. It's just a very different context and scale.
Yes, I think that might be a very good place to end. And in the last few minutes, we have open up this to a few questions. The ones that I'm able to see, okay, there's a few here. Pamela Johnson just wants to say that she was knitting as you were speaking. So I'm just going to acknowledge that. I think it's great. Fran Siegel, who is in the Yale University Art Gallery exhibition, says, curious about the photographic documentation of works which depict specific moments of action, yet experiencing the pieces themselves contain more open, empty, and silent spaces in between.
So in some ways, that's a question of documentation, right? How do you, that's been so hard. I mean, I so rarely have had the economy to really like make the film or something from it. I remember with the project that's up right here at the Armory, regretting that I didn't figure out how to be making a film about the process, like the everything that happened behind the scenes as well as the ongoing life of it. Yeah, because what it does in some ways is it reduces some of the what are live relationships to still lives, right? You have these still images, and it's almost like the documentation is as much work trying to figure that out within the economies you have as it's a whole nother project in addition to making the work. It's like this, you can see like, so that's my little mini camera riding on the small mechanism going down the volume of the rotunda at the Guggenheim. How do I document it so again it might invite you into what it might have been like. I think sound is so important to that in the documentation, and we obviously have to have the sound on all of these turned off so we can talk. But um, it's like in some ways, it's how do you not make it just like a fixed thing? It circles back to some of the same questions.
I'm going to ask you one more related question, and then I think we will stop for time. Eric Shiner, a curator, asks, your work has always been laden with residue, the residue of materials, memories, and lives lived, to name just a few, and thus the notion of trace, evidence, and hint. For me, this allows you to create haunting and poetic work that drives straight to the core of the human psyche. Can you discuss this notion of residue as it relates to your practice a bit more?
Hi, Eric. Nice. Well, that's a beautiful description. I think that it's like so many artists, one's often working with things that are passing out of circulation. Um, it's the way that our bodies wear into and mark and weather marks materials. And so that reciprocity between animals, weather, people, and how those then register in a material. I think that's part of the literacy of the work. Like one of my favorite, probably really studio activity is to go to the flea markets because it's just it's so interesting to me to even pay attention to what I pay attention to. Like, what are those objects that draw one's attention and why? And it seems like it changes from visit to visit. What I'm looking at, and I think it's partly wanting to bring maybe some of that literacy forward into the experience of the work, like the I remember being really shocked when who was I talking to? It was a student who didn't understand that wool came from sheep. Yeah, I know that sounds really silly, but it's like, our most of our consumption is so disembodied, so removed from its sources and the complexity of those. And so and I think my work, as Eric maybe points out with his question, really relies on a certain kind of knowledge of those lineages.
Do we have time for, I'm going to ask you one last question that somebody has written. Larissa Nowicki, who is a British artist. Hi, Larissa. In your work, after the completion of a work of art or performance, there often remains a resonance of the hand and or bodily engagement. Can you talk about this as a sort of embedded language and what it affords the work's meaning over time after the performance has concluded?
That's a really good question because in the sense that there are things that survive. There's artifacts. There's like the sweaters that have been rended. There's this is a poem with Susan Stewart, the cloth of those words that exists. And I think I've had, certainly there's certain things I've saved, like the records that were cut at the Armory and the spider thin web that came off of those records as the voice cut into the material of the acetate. like I have those things and I don't really always know what they are. Like, is this a work of art? No. I mean, so often for me, not. What in what space do these artifacts of those processes and tension live, and in how do um, how do I give those artifacts in some ways form so that they too can circulate in another way? So um, I look at some of those things and I think, well, I don't really know how to think about them because they're so attached to those original processes. And can they have another life? And in what way do they carry the resonance of their origin?
Well,
So,
then that becomes the museological specimen.
mhm, yeah.
I mean, this is the problem of reducing everything to a single object.
Yeah, and it's like what it is like it's the complexity of relationships between all the things that obviously is what um, I'm interested in and motivated with and by and working with, in the project. So like this thing where with the boat in Luang Prabang, it's the silence of that boat being tethered to the small boat of sound, which is the traditional instruments, the singing, and it's the way those two were joined together on the Mekong. Like to me, it's in that moment where they join that the pieces is the piece.
Which
And
also is completely experiential.
yeah, and just maybe to follow on that, Jenny, it's like, um, you know, with some pieces, it's interesting to me, maybe especially with the Armory because it was in New York and very public and not all that long ago, is that how many times I meet people and they still have a video on their phone of the experience of being on a swing or their kid on a swing or whatever, and I'm like, yeah, you can't own that, right? And there's part of me that I love that that's how that piece exists. It exists in people's bodies.
Thank you. I think that that's a really nice place to stop. Thank you so much, Anne, for this really generative conversation. And I look forward to more of them.
Oh, I do too. I mean, we make work to be in conversation, and I look forward to the next one, Jenny, and to the rest of the conference. Really, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.